I suppose if you could, I always think you can get overload in these webinars. I know with the three lads, I just tried to pick three things that I could maybe introduce to my own coaching or my own management, and maybe you might get hopefully one or two things from tonight's presentation. So I suppose the inspiration behind my study was the kind of links between education and high performance coaches. So when you trace back, when you look at a lot of really successful managers, a lot of them have a good background in school leadership or in teaching. So the likes of Jack O'Connor, there obviously down in Kerry, former principal, Brian Cody, Mickey Hart are all former teachers and principals. Jose Mourinho in the soccer world, Louis van Gaal, Rafa Benitez come from some sort of teaching background as well. And then the former Irish manager there, Joe Schmidt, in rugby, and Stuart Lancaster, who's former England rugby manager, current Leinster coach, all have a kind of a background in sport and in education. So my study really was kind of studying the links. So this was the official name of my study. So an investigation into links between leaders in sport and leaders in education, community, motivation, and conflict. So I completed that as part of a master's down in Mary I in Limerick, and I'd just like to take this opportunity as well. It was part funded by my own school, St. Joseph's College the Bishop in Galway City. So they helped with the funding of this. So I'd just like to thank them for that. And this is kind of the fruits of the labour. So I'm not going to bore you reading through it. What I've just done is maybe picked out a few bits of relevant stuff for coaches and for managers, bearing in mind that it was adult managers, so senior, inter-county, under 21, inter-county, minor, inter-county, interprovincial rugby managers, and those types of characters. So I didn't go any lower than under 18 at the time. So I had kind of two questions. Are there areas of learning in school leadership which are transferable to the sports area, sports leadership, and vice versa? Is there areas in sports that are transferable to the school? So obviously we'll be focusing on the sports side of things. So who did I interview? So I suppose for just to keep the integrity of the thesis, everybody I sat down with kind of signed a waiver or signed an agreement in advance in that it was to be completed anonymously. So I can't name people specifically, but what I can do is I can certainly pass on the information that they gave me, and I can quote them. But this is just to give you an idea of, so high performance I would deem would be, real successful people, right? So there was all our minor, 20 senior winning hurling managers, the same of football, FAI League of Ireland coaches, as well as interprovincial rugby coaches. I also interviewed 12 school principals or deputy principals as part of it. But we'll be focusing here this evening, I suppose, on the sports side of things. So there's, I suppose, three topics involved. So I'm just going to go through the three of them and throw a few bits at you, and hopefully you might pick up one or two things in relation to motivation, in relation to conflict and community. So the first thing that I had a look at, and that when I sat down with these sports coaches and managers, was the whole idea of motivation, and how do they motivate their players, how do they get a motivated group together, all working in tandem towards one goal. And one significant thing that came up in all of the conversations was kind of the style of leadership that they used with their teams. So there was great discussion, and I suppose great knowledge given in terms of your and Dennis just mentioned in the kind of coaching manual there, the idea of the lecturing manager or coach versus the empowering one. So you'll see on the right hand side, this is a scene here, Phil Brown, for any of you who follow soccer. He's lecturing to his players. I think it's half time in a Premiership match against Man City. They're 3-0 down, and he's got the finger out, and he's lecturing them, telling them what they've done wrong. And you compare that then with this guy here, anyone who follows basketball, Steve Kerr, former player and current manager of the Golden State Warriors. So he's in more of a kind of a listening pose, and he would be one that really goes down the route of empowering his players and giving them a sense of autonomy in what they do. So a lot of the high performance coaches would adopt the second method here in terms of empowering. So one way that you can do that, and one way that a lot of these high performance coaches talked about, is through the use of questioning. So you may recognise there Paul Kinnerk, who's the current Limerick hurling coach alongside John Kiley. They've won a couple of All-Irelands in the last couple of years, but he did a study in relation to questioning, right? So, and he reckoned the skill, just to quote him here, the skill of questioning, which is commonplace in teaching, is one skill where coaches may seek to bolster their coaching repertoire. So if you imagine, when COVID is all over, you might be teaching tackling, we'll say, in Gaelic football, and your cues might be, you're coaching a particular footwork, maybe a boxer stance, getting hands into the chest, and you go play a small-sided game with your players, and you've given them a set of instructions or a set of coaching that you want them to see, and you're watching, you're seeing it's not quite going the way you want it. So after 5-6 minutes, as we all do as coaches, you pull the lads in, and I suppose you have two options at this juncture. One is the lecturing way, maybe what we've seen with Phil Brown. So you could be saying to Johnny, your feet are all wrong, Johnny. You're diving in with your hands, you clothesline the guy. All right. So you've lectured to him. You've told him what he's done wrong. If you do what these high performance coaches are really key on, is maybe get information from the individual through questioning. So you might say, Johnny, what can you change in your technique to improve what you've just done there? And see, can he give you the information? Or, Johnny, what needs to happen before you do this correctly? And he might say, well, I wasn't doing my footwork properly or whatever. And what do you think of that, Tony? Would you agree with him? Is there anything else you notice? So you're kind of eliciting information out of the players rather than specifically telling them or lecturing them in what they're doing wrong. And this gives a great sense of autonomy to the player, and it can build confidence. If like, just from a teaching perspective, students and players are no different. They get a real buzz out of giving a correct answer. So rather than you telling the answer, maybe can you get the answer from it? So there's a dialogue that one of the coaches mentioned called a Socratic Dialogue, where basically you get the player to talk rather than to tell. My own mother works as a psychotherapist, and she's all the time on about how a patient might come in and they'll be very, very quiet, so you have to elicit information, you have to kind of get information out of them, and the only way you can do that is through the clever use of questioning. And it'd be the same as your players. So we all know questions that kind of are kind of open-ended and result in very little information. So maybe there's an example of some questions that maybe follow that kind of direction there. So what are you thinking right now? If this was to work better, what would be different? Johnny, you're out there covering space. What needs to happen to improve that scenario? How do you feel about that? What would you like to get from this session drill? So you could adapt it, before your session, in the middle of your session, at the end of your session. So if you felt this drill or session was working for you, what would it look like? So you're getting the lads to visualize and describe maybe a point of play or a tactical measure that you want to introduce. So how did that go, lads? After a session. So rather than saying, look, lads, that wasn't up to standard, or very happy with that, how do you think that went, and get them to maybe to discuss it. And what that does is kind of builds a bit of a sense of confidence. So feel free if you want to screen grab those questions there, but they're kind of the generalized versions, and you can adapt them then into, I suppose, more specific set of questions. So what steps you need to take in order to achieve this? Any steps you could take today towards achieving this? What do you feel your needs are? How do you want to get out? What do you want to get out of this? How do you feel about that? Tell me more about that. So these are all just kind of eliciting information. So you imagine you're in the middle of a session. You might be, coaching forward movement, and you're trying to encourage the players to move laterally rather than directly towards the ball. And you're watching again, small sided game, maybe 6-7 minutes. You pull them in. Do you say, the lecturing method? Do you say, Johnny, I told you to run from A to B and you're not doing it. You need to run from here to here. And Tony, you need to run from here to here. Or do you go down maybe the questioning way and say, Johnny, where's the best place for you to run in order to create space? So you can see how the two different methods might work and might encourage a bit of motivation in your players to answer. So you're talking kind of with them rather than down to them. And that's something that all of the high performance coaches I talked to were very keen to stress in relation to motivation is questioning your players. The second thing that came up was in relation to this dual management model. So you may have seen a couple of years ago, back in 2017, there was a viral video an irate Mayo supporter down in he was sitting in the bookies, and someone was videoing him, and he was talking about the management of the team, and he was getting really angry, and he said he talked about the manager. He said he's not managing the team. The two O'Shea's, Killy O'Connor, Alan Dillon, Beep, Andy Moran are managing the team, right? And he's kind of alluding to their player power, right? But in actual fact, I suppose unbeknownst to him, was that Mayo were utilising kind of this dual management model. And if we trace that back, everyone's familiar with the successful New Zealand rugby team. I suppose they started, and like a lot of things lately, they started this idea of the dual management model. We've all read the book, or we've all, I'm sure, heard of it at this stage as coaches. That book by Steve Kerr, or James Kerr rather, Legacy, and they talk about sweeping the sheds and the no undesirables in a camp. This particular case study here, which you'll see there, so a case study of excellence in elite sport, motivation climate in a world champion team. Basically, in that, they outlined kind of the outlook of how they created the world championship winning team. And within that then was this dual management model, which the Mayo manager was using, which the supporter didn't realise. But just to quote here from that particular piece, we created a leadership group, created more accountability, giving more ownership and dual management of the team. These changes reflected the coach's desire to deliberately foster autonomy. So the more you foster autonomy with players, the more they feel motivated, and the more they feel encouraged within the setup. So how did that work in practice, and how does it compare, I suppose, with the GAA world? So a couple of things that they did. So this is just quote directly from it. Also getting them to present some of the stuff to the team. If we're playing Australia on Saturday, one of the leaders might be up in front of the group. He might be presenting some of the attack game plan. Down below then, so Coach Smith compared a sports team to running a business. It's like if you're in business and your employees feel like they own the company, then they're going to put a hell of a lot of work into it. So they've created kind of an ownership capacity within the players. And again, this is motivating for players because it makes them feel included. In the soccer world, you may have seen, it's on Sky documentaries there, End of the Storm it's called, and within that documentary it's obviously about Liverpool winning the Premiership title after 30 years, but there's an interview with Virgil van Dijk in it, and he's talking about leadership and the leadership style of Jurgen Klopp, and he mentions that there's a leadership group very similar to that dual management model, to give it its fancy name, that New Zealand had. And he said that himself and Jordan Henderson, the captain, James Milner, and Jorginho Wijnaldum were part of this leadership group. So they represented the greater player body, and they worked under the leadership then of Jurgen Klopp. And he spoke about how he felt empowered, and he felt that he was part of the decision making, and he felt it had a very positive influence then on his performances on the pitch. So how did it, I suppose I brought this kind of information to the inter-county managers and put it to them, do they use leadership groups? How do they work? What happens in them? So these are just some quotes I pulled from the thesis of lads I talked to. So the first one there, I targeted 5 key individuals, and we'd meet before all big games at a different time to the collective group. The manager leads the discussion, but everyone would have a say. When I speak at a collective meeting, then I will have a greater amount of buy-in because I already have 5 players bought in. The other one there is saying, I want you to look at the opposition from a defensive point of view and come back to me next week with a few clips, and you do a presentation on that. So you can see it's a carbon copy of that original New Zealand model from the early 2010s, and similar to what I just showed in relation to Liverpool. So we try and get them to do the video analysis for us. I'll get them to present to the whole team. Leadership groups prove especially helpful for getting a flavour for the mood of the camp and whether the lads are happy with the way things are going. So you may find things are going well, or you may get some advice, you may get some pieces of information that you might necessarily get. One interesting conversation I had was with an All-Ireland winning manager, and he was speaking about this leadership group that he had. And he said to his starting midfielder a couple of weeks before the All-Ireland, he gave them the clips of the opposition goalkeeper, of all his kickouts, and he said, I want you to analyse all these kickouts, and I want you to present to the players the story basically of this goalkeeper's kickout. So the player went away and he watched all the kickouts, and he discovered their upcoming opposition in the final had conceded 3 goals. And after each goal, the goalkeeper did the exact same kick out after so they obviously had a sort of ploy. If we concede a goal, this is what we'll do. So he made a note of that. He was able to, the week before they were in camp, before the All Ireland, and he was presented to the manager first, and then he presented it to the players, and they said, "Look, lads, if we score a goal on next week, this is going to happen." So sure enough, they go to the following week, they score a goal in the first half, and the goalkeeper comes out and puts the ball on the tee. So the cue was that they'd empty out one side of the pitch. So if you can just see this diagram here, they emptied out the bottom, as we look at it here, side of the pitch, and the number 11 would move from the centre forward position out to the left hand side, and the goalkeeper would pin the ball on top of his head, and he was quite a strong catcher in the air. So it's kind of like their get out clause. If we concede a goal, well, we're winning the next ball to get down the pitch. So through this leadership model, the midfielder for the team they're talking about was able to identify this, be able to prepare for it. So they got the goal immediately. They were cued into the next kick out. He was able to move towards where the number 11 is positioned there, break it down to all his teammates who were aware of what was going to happen. They won the ball and got another point. And the manager just stressed that as a real good example of that leadership capacity working in practice, whereby all the players, even they commented on it at half time, and they got a real sense of motivation from it. So if you can get that into your team, they obviously struck gold in that particular example, but it's just a great practical example of how it can work for a team if you were to use it. This is Stuart Lancaster here. So anyone who follows him, he's the current Leinster coach, former England rugby manager. But I highly recommend he has a series of leadership, or what would you call them, podcasts or videos on off the ball leaders questions they're called. There's about 6 or 7 of them there. He also, well worth to follow, those of you who are on LinkedIn, well worth to follow on LinkedIn. And he also runs this leadership masterclass at the moment. I don't get any gratuity for mentioning it, but it's €100. It's a good investment for any manager or coach maybe who wants to delve further into this kind of stuff. But he talks about imagining your team in 3 groups, and how a leadership group might influence things. So he says, if you gave your players the instruction, I want you to stand on your head every day for 12 minutes, and it'll help you make you a better player. And he said, the first group will be the kind of early adopters, and they'll say, yeah, no problem, do you want us to stand on our head 3 times a day, 4 times a day, 5 times a day? We don't mind, we'll do it. And you've the middle group who might be undecided, and then you've got maybe a few players in the bottom group who are saying, I don't fancy, standing on my head. Maybe could we lie down instead, or could we sit down instead? And he argues that the beauty of a leadership group is they'll be in your first group, and what they'll do is they'll pull in the undecided group with them, and they'll pull some of the the resistors or the people who don't want to kind of go along with what the plan is. And the beauty is it's player led rather than manager led. So it's not the manager, going back to use that word, of dictating or lecturing. It's player led. So they're more likely to learn from their peers, and they're more likely to bring people along with them if it's peer to peer rather than manager to peer. But that's Stuart Lancaster's theory on it. So just some considerations if this was a role that you were going to go down, or if it's something that you do, maybe consider where you're at with the use of leadership groups. So what characteristics do you want in your leaders? Who are the most influential players? Who are the most consistent performers? The best listeners? The best leadership qualities? How will you select them? Will you have an election, or will you select them? Will that be seen as fair or unfair? How often you'll meet, and most importantly, then, what level of autonomy will they be given? So you don't want to get into the realm of that irate Mayo supporter, where the accusations are he's not managing the team, the players are managing the team. So you want to get away from that kind of player power. So it's kind of a team scenario rather than the players have taken over the running of the team, and that's quite important. And there are considerations that the inter-county managers that I spoke about, that you need to think long and hard about those considerations before you'd go down this route. And one manager used the analogy of stating you need to throw your players in the river, so using the letters of river. And by using the leadership groups, by using the questioning, you're making the players feel relevant and important and valued, and most importantly, they're empowered or respected. And these leadership groups can be formal, like I've just illustrated there, the New Zealand or the inter-county ones. And they also can be informal, so it doesn't have to be a stated thing. It could be just you going around to influential players within the group, maybe calling them or speaking to them before, after training, running things by them, and then letting the word kind of filter out throughout the squad through that. So you can do it through a kind of a formal or an informal path, whatever is most suitable or most work. But that's something that the inter-county coaches and rugby coaches that I spoke to found very helpful, and they would attribute a lot of their success in terms of winning All-Irelands to creating those groups. Another thing that they mentioned that they thought was really, really important in terms of the manager themselves is this idea that, to use that quote, EQ is more important than IQ. So your emotional quotient or your emotional intelligence is much more important than your actual intelligence. So just to use this quote here, so I feel that it's important to have a coach who is sensitive to when an athlete is able to receive criticisms and when he is a little vulnerable to criticism, perhaps, and maybe needs more encouragement. Okay, so aware of their surroundings. And one coach I spoke about this idea of filling the cup. So, you as a manager or a coach, are you aware of maybe how you're confident your players are, or their own lives or their home situation? And are you aware that there's at times when their cup will be empty, or it'll be half full, and that you need to provide them maybe with a sense of energy and enthusiasm and positivity? It could be just a quiet word or a little conversation, and that you go and you fill their cup and you get them up to the level. And so you're aware, and that comes down to kind of the idea of emotional intelligence. And there's a lot involved, but two that these coaches that I spoke to mentioned a lot would be the idea, especially they would be really, really forceful on this idea of self-regulation. So GAA, we're all, as Damien mentioned there, we're all volunteers, nobody's getting paid. So you have to go to your job and your family life. So, you might have had a row with the wife or with the husband or whoever it is. You might have had a bad day at work. Things didn't go well, bad news. You may have had an awful sleep night before, maybe a baby keeping you awake. You may have been rushing out to training, didn't get to have a feed, didn't get to stop for a cup of coffee. And you arrive at your location, your training centre, or whatever it is, and you're not in great form. And they would really stress the importance of press and reset before you leave your car, and not bringing that baggage with you into the training session. So you kind of need to have to sometimes put on an act and disguise maybe your own problems. So more than filling the cup of your players, be conscious of well how empty is your own cup, and you need to maybe disguise that and self-regulate. So reset and go into a new environment, go into the training environment, and so you're setting the tone. And the other is this idea of self-awareness. And I know Brian spoke really well last week about body language and energy and how important that was. And at the end of the day, all the coaches would stress that the manager sets the tone, right? And the coach or whoever's in charge of the session sets the tone. So are you displaying the right body language and energy? If you've arrived in kind of head down and all and peed off and negative and cranky, it's not going to create a great sense of energy for your own management team, and also for the players when they go out. So, you want the players to reflect your energy, you want the players to reflect your kind of personality, and you do that by your own self-awareness and being self-regulated and pressing reset maybe in the car, and being conscious, how do I look to the players when I'm talking and when I'm whatever body language it is that I have. Another thing then, just maybe a practical tip that it could be useful is just for in terms of communication and building relationships, and the idea of gold standard communication. The importance of these small 5-minute conversations with various players is so important. So one thing, if you had maybe an Excel sheet. This is just a school roll book. These names aren't real. I just did this today for the purpose of the seminar, just to give you an idea. So you could visualize it, but you could do this in Excel sheet. But you could enter the names of your players on the panel. Enter them and the dates of your training sessions, or at the moment we're doing Zoom, or when you do get back out on the pitch, and you're just making a mark, putting a tick beside. I had a conversation with Craig on the 23rd of February. I talked to Gavin that day, Caleb, Nathan, Tony. It's impossible if you have a squad of 30 or 35 or 40. It's impossible to spend 5 minutes or even 3 minutes talking to 30 people. That's an hour and a half. So you can't do that every session, and it's not by design that a manager would ignore a player, right? It can just really be by accident, in that they just physically don't have the time. So this is a good way, in order, that you don't miss anybody, for maybe more than 3 sessions in a row, that you're kind of getting around. So you could, our next training session maybe is on the 7th of March. I haven't spoke to Craig there for a couple of weeks. I'm just going to check in with him or one of my management team. So this could be between you and your management team, that you're just ticking the boxes to say that you're keeping that communication going, you're keeping the relationship going, and it's acting out that emotional intelligence. You're getting a feel for how full or empty your players' cups are, and the only way you can find that out is through these conversations that you could have with your players. Then just in terms of feedback, one thing that was mentioned that you could do, and to keep things, you're always trying to keep things positive, is this idea of medal and a mission. So you're complimenting your player on something they did well, and then you're giving them an area to improve on. You're giving them a mission that'll bring them closer to the goal, to climbing the mountain, to use that analogy. So you might have a forward who did great scoring in your previous game or previous training session, but you weren't too happy with his work rate, so your conversation could be along the lines of 3 great points last, 2 on your left, 1 on your right. How's about the next day I challenge you to get 2 dispossessions of the opposition defenders as they're coming out. So medal and a mission, you're complimenting them, and you're also adding another layer. Constantly, players, every high performance manager that I talk to would really stress that they constantly want to be challenged and challenged and challenged, and they love that, especially when you're dealing with players at the elite level. And it might be a mechanism just to have kind of in your subconscious, a medal, compliment, and a mission. Give them a challenge. And Alex Ferguson, not forgetting, the power of positive feedback. I like this quote where he says, "You don't get the best out of people by hitting them with an iron rod. You do so by gaining their respect." It turns out that the 2 most powerful words in the English language are well done. So that's just a few bits in terms of motivation. The second part of the study that I interviewed these coaches was in relation to conflict. And I suppose at the outset, every manager and every high performance coach, and even like it's very relevant to the school principals, will tell you that prevention is better than cure. And I know Brian and Ducky, and listening to Jeff the last few weeks, talked a lot about environment and values and principles. And if you have them right, you can get rid of, or you can foresee a lot of conflict, and you can create a correct environment where you maybe reduce the potential for conflict. But you'll always meet, no matter how perfect, I suppose, the environment is, no how perfect the culture is, no matter how bought in the players are, you'll always get some sort of conflict. Whether it be with the players, or with parents, or with the board of your club or your county or whoever, there may be opportunities that spring up, and that at all times they would always stress the need to de-escalate, all right, and to de-escalate things and bring them down a level as much as possible. To always meet it head on is very important, and honesty and integrity were really to the forefront of discussions. And I suppose if you don't de-escalate, not to say that this would ever happen, but I just think this was a funny part as part of our study when we were studying this in as part of the masters. This was given an example of when things can escalate. So there was a 2-year. This is a true story in England. So a 2-year dispute over a hedge ends in fatal shooting. So a pensioner was dead, and his neighbour was being questioned by police yesterday in what appears to be the latest case of hedge rage. Who knew that was a thing? They argued about a privet hedge dividing 2 front lawns in a Lincoln cul-de-sac. The tone may have been set 2 years ago when Robert Dickinson, 52, suddenly decided to take the cutters to the offending hedge. So what transpired, or what happened, was it started with he cut the hedge without his neighbour's permission. And there was kind of a war of words and verbals, and it went from that then to, I think they started with scraping cars and breaking the windows of cars, and then breaking the windows of the houses, and then obviously one of them ended up dead. I suppose that's where conflict can go wrong, and that's, I suppose, a warning, to get back to the kind of de-escalate. You don't want a minor issue of a hedge escalating, so you don't want a minor player issue or parent issue or any other issue that you have escalating out of control. And every manager really stressed that. And what's at the core of conflict, and what's really important, is the idea of perspective. And that's at the heart of all conflict, is people see things from a different perspective. So you have two lads looking at the same thing here, right? One sees 6 and one sees 9. So they're looking at it from a different perspective. So your player might see something from their perspective, and you as a manager see it from your perspective. And one of the managers mentioned something that I thought was very helpful. Was he said, players or people that you're in conflict with, they do bad things for what they think are good reason. So in their head, it makes sense to them that they did a particular action or didn't do a particular action. And I think if you have that in your head, that people do, things wrong for what they think is good reason at that particular time, it helps you keep a sense of calm and a sense of understanding. And it just going back to that word, to de-escalate, it helps you de-escalate if you say, well, this person did this for what they thought was a good reason. So you're looking at it kind of from their perspective. So, how do you deal with conflict? Came up in the course of the study as well, right? So this Thomas Kilman model put this together, and basically how you deal with conflict applied kind of to different animals. So you have your kind of level of cooperativeness down the bottom versus your level of assertiveness on the side. So at the bottom, you have the turtle, right? And the turtle would be kind of the worst thing you can do. They avoid they avoid conflict. So, a house might be on fire, engulfed in flames, smoke coming out, and they turn their back to it and, saying, fire, what fire? I don't know what you're talking about. So they avoid all conflict. So it's avoidance is not good. The teddy bear then is kind of the accommodator. So it's kind of like, everything will be okay. Everything will work out. And when you go down that line, things can escalate and get out of hand if you say, sure, it'll be fine. And that doesn't tend to happen. Or if someone comes along with an issue to you and you're a teddy bear and you say, yeah, go for that, even if you don't agree with it or goes against the principles or the core of what you're doing. And then you have the fox, who's kind of the compromiser, who's kind of sees both sides of a conflict and kind of gives up one bit from one side and one bit from another side and comes to a compromise. And then at the top, you have the owl, who kind of confronts the conflict and kind of tries to collaborate and talk it out and come to some sort of conclusion. And then you have the shark, right? And the shark is kind of the competitor, very assertive. And they say, it's my way or the highway. This is how we're going to do it. And this is the only way that we're going to do it. And I suppose all the coaches, to quote one of them, you need to pick the right tool at the right time for the right person or the right situation. So you may need to be the owl at times to collaborate. You may need to be the fox, to compromise. You may need to be the shark at times, depending on the situation, but that you're aware, I suppose, what approach you're taking to a situation and you adopt as sees fit. And I suppose two very high profile examples, maybe from the GAA world. In recent years, you had the case of Jim McGuinness and Kevin Cassidy with the release of the book, and Kevin Cassidy kind of, I don't know, did he reveal some of the details of McGuinness's training in it? And McGuinness took the shark. So I'm not saying these are right or wrong, just going to use them as examples, but McGuinness kind of took the shark approach, and he said, this is my way, you need to take the highway. And he later, as I was watching the Laker GAA there of Kevin Cassidy a couple of weeks ago, he was invited back into the panel and he said no. And so, I suppose that went beyond the point of return. So maybe would an owl or a fox approach to that particular scenario have worked better? Now, McGuinness would argue that he won his All-Ireland, so it might be all a moot point, but just to give you an example, I suppose. And then you had Jim Gavin and Dermot Connolly. And you had some sort of issues there, and Jim Gavin adopted the shark approach and he removed Jim Connolly from the panel, and then they kind of came to a compromise and invited him back in and got him back into the squad, and he ended up coming on at half time in that All-Ireland against Mayo and kicking two crucial points. So I suppose there's no right or wrong way. I suppose the worst thing you could do is the turtle effect, which is pretend things aren't happening and ignore it or avoid it. But I really think that picking the right tool at the right time is quite a good thing to have your management structure. And then some strategies that some of the coaches mentioned, and one really good one was the what if scenario. So I suppose we all as managers and coaches have the what if scenarios in terms of, what if we got a man sent off, or what if, a particular forward is causing us trouble, or whatever the case may be. But what if scenarios in terms of conflict? So identifying where you may get areas of conflict. So, areas with players or parents. And I suppose the most obvious ones would be players not getting game time. And, if a parent was to ring, I suppose when underage capacity, if a parent was to ring saying, he's not playing or he wasn't picked, that you're, I suppose, prepared and capable of dealing with that in advance, that just phone call just doesn't land on your lap, and you've no idea how to deal with the scenario. So you've identified kind of what if scenarios, and you're conscious of what might happen, and you're jotting down. So, if I have a conflict maybe with a member of my management or with a player or a parent, what would be the set of steps that I would take to deal with that. Another one then mentioned was kind of this idea of a sandwich technique. Maybe if you have to deliver not so good news to a player, you could sandwich the negative or the area to improve in two bits of positive news. That's something we use in the teaching profession. The idea then of this one I really liked was the ABC. Or the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence, or the three C's. It's also known as the cause, the course, and the consequence. So when you're analysing, a conflict situation, what caused it, what course did it take, and what was the consequence, and you want to get to the beginning and get to the I suppose the crux of the issue. Why did this player act in this particular way, and you're being conscious of their feelings and being conscious of maybe the events. And then you've got integrative bargaining, which I think I would say, I'm only guessing, I don't know, but I would say Jim Gavin sat down with Jim McConnelly and did a bit of integrative bargaining, whereby they sat down and kind of understood each other's perspectives and understood each other's kind of needs and wants and demands, and came to some sort of conclusions. But they're just some strategies that various managers, I suppose, have in their armory or have in their toolbox, that they might want to whip out to deal with such scenarios. But I think, most importantly, and what comes across really strongly from talking to all these high performance, whether it be soccer or rugby, hurling or football, is the importance of honesty and being open to meet these scenarios kind of head on, that you don't let them fester and let things get worse, that you have the idea of de-escalate in your head all the time, and you don't avoid conflict is probably the worst thing that you can do. And the last part, I suppose, of the study and the interviews that I did, and hopefully you're still listening, and thanks a million if you are, is this whole idea of community. And now I know this was covered in detail by the lads previous to me, so I don't want to be going over the same stuff. So I'm just going to maybe throw out a couple of bits here that may be useful. And a key thing, in relation to creating a sense of community, and I suppose I'm using all these words kind of interlinked, community, kind of a sense of culture, a positive atmosphere. Consistency is the key. One manager was really forthright in that. There's a guy there on YouTube, Simon Simonek. Some of you may listen to him, but he's got a really good set of videos in terms of leadership. But he was being interviewed once, and the interviewer said to him, can you describe good leadership? It's just a great way of remembering. He turned around and he said to the interviewer, he said, "Do you love your wife?" And he said, "Yeah, I do." And he said, "Tell me the exact date that you fell in love with your wife." And the interviewer was kind of taken aback. He said, "Well, I can't tell you an exact date that I fell in love." And Simonek then argued, he said, you can't identify the exact date. It was a consistent level of effort in terms of being nice to his wife, and maybe doing good deeds for the wife, and maybe cooking dinner for the wife, or telling the wife that how he felt about her, and that consistently over time they gradually fell in love. And he used that analogy to describe building a culture or building a community within your team, that it's a series of good deeds done, it's a series of good things or minor small issues done over a period of time that helps to bring that about. He also talks about the idea of washing your teeth, and he uses that analogy, something I actually use with my history students in study. But you don't, your teeth aren't clean by going to the dentist once a year or twice a year. They're clean because you consistently wash them in the morning for 2 minutes, and you wash them in the evening for 2 minutes, and they stay clean. he also talked about going to the gym. You don't go to the gym once and come home and look in the mirror and say, I'm an animal, or I've got a six pack, or whatever it is. It's working consistently in the gym over a number of weeks and over a number of months. And he argues, and a lot of the high performance coaches say, the consistency of that, of doing good things, small little things really well, going back to the questioning, or going back to the body language, or going back to the filling the cup, or going back to making your players feel relevant and important and valued. That all contributes towards, I suppose, building up that sense of culture, or building up that sense of community. The second thing that came out of the research and the interviews that I did with the various people I talked to was the power of using stories or themes. So I suppose I've given you 2 or 3 stories there from Simon Simonek in terms of falling in love, or washing teeth, or the gym, and you can extend that out then into maybe larger stories for your team. So he used the example of the moon landing. I suppose it's very relevant now after Mars last week or the week before, and Apollo 11, and they landed in 1969. So I suppose, not to give you a history lesson, but at the beginning of the 1960s, there was a space race between the USA and the USSR, who could land on the moon first. And Yuri Gagarin was the first man in space for the Russians, and the Americans were very keen. So there was the whole communism versus democracy battle going on. So the Americans were determined to prove, well, they had the first person in space, we'll have the first person on the moon. And you can apply the story of that then to your actual panel of players that you have. So at the beginning of 1960, JFK gave a speech, a very famous speech, and he said, he set a goal, or he set a target, that we're going to have a man on the moon by the end of the decade. So by the end of 1960s, we're going to have a man on the moon. So you could use that then as a goal. Our goal at the end of the season, or at the end of the session, or our proverbial landing on the move, lads or ladies, is going to be this. During the course then of the moon landing race, there was a famous story that JFK went to visit the NASA headquarters, and he's walking through the NASA headquarters, and there's a janitor mopping the floor, and he goes over and he says, other than cleaning the floors, what other duties do you do around here? And as the story goes, the janitor turns around to him and he says, well, Mr. President, my job is I'm helping to land the USA on the moon. So there was a great sense of purpose in that whole story. Everybody was kind of contributing towards it. So you apply that, I suppose, to a team mechanism. They had something like 300,000 people working during the course of that decade, 300,000 people working on the space program to get them to land on the moon. And they all had that one goal, or that one purpose. We're all contributing towards landing on the moon. So you apply that to your team. If you had your kit man and your secretary and your management and your chef and your physio or whatever, your bus driver, you were all contributing towards a performance on the pitch, or we're all contributing towards winning, a Connacht title or a county title or an All Ireland. It might, the power story worked for this particular manager that I talked to. Down the bottom there, the second picture, we'll all be probably familiar with Armstrong and Aldrin, who actually got to walk on the moon. But as part of that story, a lesser known character, Michael Collins, no relation to our own Irish revolutionary, but there was 3 of them actually in orbit around the moon, and only 2 of them got to walk on the moon. So it was his job to remain above the moon, orbiting the moon, while the 2 lads went down and walked on the moon. So he didn't get, I suppose, the acclaim of walking on the moon, but his role was vitally important to the overall success of the team. And this manager used that in relation to his subs, and he's, Michael Collins is orbiting. He has a role to play there. Your subs have a role to play. They might not get to actually go onto the pitch or proverbially walk on the moon, but they have a huge role in training, or in the warm up, or body language in remaining positive. So you want all your players and management to be kind of realise that. So that was just kind of one story or theme that came out. Another one that was used that I found quite interesting, and you might find helpful, is this idea of, will it make the boat go faster? So those of you who are familiar with this, the British Olympic rowing team were averaging, I think, about 7th position in their various regattas in their, maybe 2-3 years out from the Olympic Games, I think in Sydney in 2000. And they adopted this policy of, will it make the boat go faster? So every behaviour that they did, everything they did in their daily life, they asked themselves, will this make the boat go faster? So their diet, when they're going to eat something, their sleep, their attitude towards the gym, their attitude towards recovery, maybe their attitude towards alcohol or late nights or going to weddings or whatever the case may be. And they asked themselves the question, well, will it make the boat go faster? And if it did, they did it. And if they didn't, then they left it out of their lifestyle. And they would attribute this mindset and this behavior change, they would attribute this to the catapulted them from an average of seventh position to getting the gold medal in the Sydney Olympic Games. And it can be a very powerful story, I suppose, or theme to use with a panel of players. I know they have a book out, Will It Make the Boat Go Faster? And they also have a couple of podcasts, and you get a good bit of stuff online in relation to them as well if you wanted to explore further. But they were steadfast in this idea, and it brought about a great sense of commitment and dedication to a cause, and ultimately they were successful. Could you use that so in life story for your own team might be something that could be successful. And other stories or analogies that were highlighted by some of the managers. So I mentioned there Apollo 11, or will it make the boat go faster? This idea of a wave, so the colours of your club or maybe your county, and applying that into the analogy maybe of a wave or tsunami, kind of getting a sense of power. The explorations of Shackleton and Tom Crean, maybe going to the Arctic Circle and overcoming kind of all the problems there. Sebastian Delcano circumnavigating the world and the first person to circumnavigate the world and the journey he took. The Band of Brothers is one that was used by one particular manager. They were a set of soldiers who landed, paratroopers in D-Day, and they were getting fire from German soldiers. The Last Dance is probably the most famous or most obvious. It's a Netflix TV docu-series in relation to the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan. The manager sat down in the first meeting with the players and he said, we're all close to retirement. This is my last year in charge. Some of you will never play for this club again. This is the last dance, and that story of kind of this is our last chance saloon. And they ultimately went on and had a success with the Chicago Bulls. This idea of the edge of the cliff and how far can you fly. So all your training, your diet, your preparation, and you're bringing your players to the edge of the cliff on the day of the game, and you're challenging them to, you're saying to them, how far can you fly, lads, or ladies. Martin Luther King, or this idea of being on a mission, and if you're not on it, you're kind of missing out. And the last one then is the energy bus. So getting the right people in the right positions on your bus and leaving anybody who's negative energy off your bus and removing them from the group. So they're just some things that came up. I just chose two, I suppose, to share with you, just to give you an idea of what these high performance coaches, some of them are using in their work. So just, I suppose, to summarize what I've thrown at you there, and hopefully you got one or two bits of information that you may be able to use in your own management or coaching. As I said, this isn't my information. This is information I've gathered from 15 very successful managers and coaches over a 2-year period. So in terms of motivation, the idea of lecturing versus eliciting, and how you might use questioning to elicit information from your players, the dual management model, or the player leadership group, your emotional intelligence, making your players feel relevant, important, valued, empowered, and respected. Maybe the role book for communication, so no player gets left behind. Medal and a mission mechanism for feedback. And then the conflict that all stress, the kind of prevention's greater than cure. The conflict styles that you bring, always thinking about de-escalation, meeting conflict early, the right tool for the right person at the right time, and having a sense of your what if scenarios. And just as I spoke there, consistency and how crucial that is, in relation to falling in love or brushing your teeth, and the use of stories or themes or analogies to make it relevant or understandable for your players, maybe the Apollo mission, and will it make the boat go faster? So if you've survived this long, thanks for listening. Hopefully I didn't drag on too long. if anyone wants a copy of my thesis, you may find it interesting. You can email me a.glynn@bish.ie. I'll be more than happy to share it with anybody who'd like to read up on it. And if there's any high performance coaches who are present or maybe listening to the recording at a later date and like to partake in the study, I'd love to hear from you as well. And a lot of the coaches found that, when they had to answer questions and think about motivation and think about conflict and think about community, that, it was kind of like a refresher course for themselves in what they were doing and what they were at. So I'll hand back to Dennis and Damien there. So thanks very much for your time, everyone.
Cheers, Alan. Just a few questions there. We'll just take a few questions. So what's the best piece of information one of the managers revealed during the course of your study? I know there was a lot of high profile managers, but anything stand out for you?
I suppose one that stands out would be the importance of relationships. One particular manager, a question similar to that, I suppose he said his answer was relationships, and the strength of your squad, the strength of your management really, and how successful you're going to be would be built on, how powerful and how strong and how enduring your relationships that you build up with your player, and that's something that really, one particular coach mentioned, relationships was really strong.
Yeah, good. Just another one there. What did the manager say was the worst part of their role or their job as managers?
Great question. I suppose the idea of kind of being at service to other people, and maybe that it proved a hindrance on their own family lives or their own diet or their own health, and one particular manager, was saying to me how he put on like a stone and a half managing an inter-county team because he's devoting all his time towards managing the team and looking after 32 lads and a management team of whatever 20 or at the time or whatever it was, and I suppose he forgot to look after himself and to look after family, and found that difficult. The obvious one really that would all the time come out would be the hard decisions of maybe dropping a player prior to an All-Ireland or a big game, or they're not being included, with the 24-man Toggin or the 26-man Toggin squad. Those difficult conversations are obviously not pretty. Everyone's on a high, building up to an All-Ireland, and they had to, I suppose, ring or meet someone and deliver, heartbreaking news, I suppose.
Yeah. Just another one here. Was there any real bad example of conflict that one of the managers mentioned?
I suppose from a club perspective, one All-Ireland club manager, the old curse of the drink, and they didn't have a drinking ban, and a lot like that's one thing. All these managers would never introduce a so-called drinking ban. Obviously, we're talking about adults here, but he got wind that a player was doing something that he shouldn't have been doing in a pub, and I suppose he was very hurt by that because he went back and looked or maybe reflected and said, is that something I done wrong? Is maybe the community aspect or the the culture that I built into the squad was obviously not up to standard, that player would go and go do something like that. So I suppose they were kind of personally hurt and let down by that. The example I'm thinking of, the player was a very good player, and you can't, in a club scenario, you're kind of caught because there was family, close family involved, and they didn't live far from each other, and it was a manager who was actually from the area. It wasn't one of these outside managers. So dealing with all of that was kind of messy, and dealing with that was kind of in the correct format, I suppose, was the worst case of conflict that was brought to me.
Right, and just one more. I suppose you've been involved in a lot of underage teams, but how would you? Any recommendations on how to deal with awkward parents?
Great question. I suppose you get. I've been I don't think 6 years in the academies at this stage, and unfortunately you have to have a selection process. and even in my professional life, you know, teach for the last 12 years, you come across, I suppose, awkward parents from time to time. I'd say, you know, honesty is has to be the forefront of what you're doing. You know, if you're very honest, and you're kind of, you deal with people with honesty and integrity, you know, that's the best way. That is the best policy to deal with anyone who kind of comes at you, or any parent that might be upset. And you also have to, you know, this is something I learned from listening to those managers that I interviewed, was, you know, you have to understand things from their perspective. So, you know, parent, like, I'm a new parent myself, and like, I'd love my young lad to be playing football, and I probably think he's going to be brilliant. And so you have to see it from parent perspective as well, that's the way they're viewing their son or their daughter, and you have to be mindful of that and understanding. And a lot of times, I think listening to actually understand what the parent is saying is quite important. So you're not listening to respond, you're listening to actually listen to the parent and listen to the problem, and get, you know, it goes back to maybe that diagram of the 6 or the 9. You know, what's their perspective? I have a certain perspective of the player. What's the parent's perspective? And so you understand their perspective, maybe explain from your perspective in a real honest way, and you can't go too far wrong if you're very honest. You'd go down an awful route, you know, if you lied or you exaggerate something. In one word, honesty, Dennis, is the best policy there. Yeah.
Cheers, Alan. That was really informative, and loads of tips for all the coaches. I'm just going to hand over to Damien there, and he's going to close up. Cheers.
Thanks, Dennis.
Thanks very much, Dennis. And look at Alan, you had in one of your slides there a gold standard communication. Well, I can assure you, you had a gold standard presentation as well. It was so open, so honest, and so informative, and we really appreciate it, Alan. The horizontal management, dual management system, questioning and listening, leadership groups, emotional intelligence, learning through questioning, and a key sentence for every player every night. It had the lot. So look at Alan, from Galway Coaching and Games and from Galway County Board, appreciate your time, your honesty, and we'd have you on again. You were gold standard, Alan. Fair play.
Thanks very much, Damien, and thanks, Dennis, for putting together the programme. Very enjoyable. And thanks everyone for listening.
No problem. So look at, lads and ladies, still on the call. March the 10th there, we had planned with the county board chairman there, Pat Carney, we'd planned 4 webinars. Tonight is night 4, but you know, lockdown, we're still bound by guidelines until April the 5th. So we'll put on another webinar there next Wednesday night. It'll be at a later time of 8 o'clock. Our presenter will be Martin Fogarty, who's former Kilkenny coach, with Brian Cody for 8 years for 8 Liam McCarthy's, and he's currently the national hurling manager with Crow Park. So Martin will be delivering, and I'll be assisting him next week at 8 o'clock, and we'll be sending out information there through social media, how to book, how to get on. The topic will be managing a team, youth and adult. The following Wednesday night is St. Patrick's night. I think we'll give you the night off, and we'll have a final webinar there on March the 24th to be confirmed. So look at Alan and everybody on the call, and Dennis, thanks very much for all your cooperation and the work you do in the background as well, Dennis. So we'll sign off. So Alan, and thanks so much.
Thanks a million, guys.